The old adage states that any journey, even one of 1,000 steps, starts with but a single one. Even the hardest trek apparently has an apparent destination. How then must it feel to have our expected destination become nothing more than a mere blind turn we could never see coming? Indeed, this is exactly how it felt to come to the realization that confession does not always provide, and in this instance, certainly does not equal explanation. If anything, confession has merely confirmed our thoughts and presumptions of how such a tragic circumstance could have occurred. Indeed, this simply added yet another twisted pathway of an ever-evolving labyrinth that sprawled out in front of what appeared to be a horrific, yet simplistic journey of justice for those left behind. Join us now as we try to traverse these next twisted turns in the story of the Hillier triple murder, here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
My name, of course, is Daniel Panozzo, and again, I'm joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster. We want to welcome and thank you all for listening yet again to another episode of Just Lawful. We do hope that if you haven't heard our previous episodes, that you will go back now and listen to those on both either iTunes or Spotify. While you're there, we'd love for you to rate, review, and give us some feedback. Before we begin this episode, as always in this series, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that the following program contains the names and references to people who have died. If you find anything we discussed distressing, please make use of the following support resources: the Victim Support Service on 8231 5626 or 1800 182 368. The Domestic Violence Crisis Service on 1300 782 200. The Domestic Violence Gateway Service on 1800 800 098. Or the National Sexual Assault Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service on 1800 RESPECT.
This episode marks the 5th anniversary of the deaths of the murders of Adeline Yvette Wilson Rigney and her children, Amber and Corey. In commemoration of that anniversary, their families have released balloons at the site of their graves. Red balloons for Yvette, purple balloons for Amber, and yellow balloons for Corey. Those are some favourite colours with some very deep meaning and significance for all three individuals and those they've left behind. Daniel, myself, and everyone here at Just Lawful want to send our ongoing condolences, respect, support, and love to Yvette, Corey, and Amber's families on this difficult day and on all days.
Sean, at the end of our last episode, you talked about going back to court after a 6-month hiatus. You walked in, you were hit with, can we have a 2-hour adjournment? That was done. You walked back into court expecting this legal battle to find that there was yet another twist and turn where Stephen Peat decided he was now going to say guilty, guilty, guilty. Sean, what next?
We were all in shock. Myself, the families, nobody was expecting Pete to do that. Donna Rigney, the mother of Yvette Rigney, the grandmother of Amber and Corey, put her head on her knees and wept. Steve Egberts and his wife Janet Wells, the grandparents of Corey and Amber on the paternal side, were just beside themselves, clinging to one another and crying. We had been geared up for a battle of the experts, for psychological evidence to determine once and for all whether Stephen Graham Peat was in a dissociative state, whether he was an automaton when he killed Corey and Amber. Instead, here he is confessing to the whole lot. And the explanation of the change of circumstances came, as it should, from his own counsel. Defence barrister Bill Boko SC explained to Justice Malcolm Blue, Your Honour was aware the issue in this case was one arising from the opinion expressed by a psychologist of disassociation. having received the prosecution's report and considered material that had not previously been known to him, mid-last week, that original psychologist provided a report wherein he revised his opinion.
Okay. What does that actually mean, Sean? So I take from that we said one thing, a psychologist who looked at him has now got some more information and maybe is second-guessing what he originally said.
Do you remember we said last episode that the DPP came back with a psychological report of their own and said, we're going to call a psychologist, we're going to call other witnesses, we're going to put this to the papers. We're not even going to have a hearing about this. We're just going to give all the information to Justice Malcolm Blue to decide on the paperwork.
Yep.
The defence has read the paperwork and gone, we're out of luck. We cannot maintain this position any longer because this other psychological report has somehow come through and bulldozed everything we thought we knew.
Mm-hmm.
And we've handed that to our original psychologist, the one that we hired, the one that said disassociation, the one that said automaton, and he's gone, yeah, having read what my colleague has written, I now agree with my colleague. But at this point, Daniel, I've got no idea what's been said.
Yeah, so we've now gone from a situation, as you said, of expecting a battle of the experts, if you like, to actually, I'm going to revise my position because what my colleague has said, I actually get, that makes more sense now, and I'm going to perhaps not lean so heavily into my initial sort of, judgment of this person.
And while this is a very important part of the court process, while we must always give the court time to come to the evidence and discern what needs to be discussed, 6 months have passed of increasing anguish and torment for the Rigney and Egbert's families. 6 months that they have waited to get some sort of clarity, and instead of clarity, they get confession.
So this is what I was going to say, and I'm glad you brought that up, because the other element of this, it's not just that court process of innocent, guilty, let's go down that. There are people's lives, emotions, their grief, which has, let's face it, it's not just an incident happens, we bury someone, we move on. There is still this ongoing, protracted situation that they're still living through.
Someone very wise once said to me, guilt is ongoing, but lives go on hold.
Yeah.
That's the situation that these families found themselves in, especially now because with a guilty plea, what comes next? Sentencing submissions. What's part of sentencing submissions? Victim impact statements. So Justice Malcolm Blue says, all right, we'll come back at the end of the week and we'll do sentencing submissions because this has dragged on long enough.
Yeah.
We need to now move on. Talk about a gear change. Steve, Janet, and Donna have gone from preparing for a trial a second time to have your victim impact statements ready by the end of the week.
And that was what I was going to say. And, I said in the intro to this episode, just another twisted path we couldn't possibly see coming. We've gone in expecting yet again another trial procession, which again has been interrupted and changed the course of yet again. And as you said, by the way, while you're still trying to make sense of this, now it's on you. The onus is have your victim impact statements ready by the end of this week.
Have your victim impact statements ready with no understanding yet as to why your loved ones die. You know how.
Yep.
You know who. But you don't know why.
Yeah.
And you may not know why because all of the psychologists have agreed back of house.
Mm-hmm.
Prosecution and defense have agreed back of house, more accurately. And to be fair, defense have capitulated back of house. The judge will get to read those reports in due time and add it to his sentencing considerations. But it's not necessarily going to be a public discussion, or so we thought, because Justice Malcolm Blue had one more thing to say before he adjourned court for the day.
Mm-hmm.
You remember how when defense first raised automatonism as a defense, he wanted to see that report.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll remember that Mr. Boko declined to do so.
Indeed.
He said, no, I'm not going to lay my cards on the table just yet. It's for the prosecution to disprove us.
Churlish, I believe you used was the term.
He did not want to be churlish. That's right. Well, the prosecution's disproven you. Like we said, bulldozed you out of the way. Your own expert has now changed his mind. Quite reasonably, Justice Malcolm Blue said, I'll have that report now. And I believe it should be made public.
I can only contend that was not necessarily what, I guess, certainly the defence wanted to happen, to have something which exposes, if you like, the internal makeup of their client to the public.
Justice Blue really didn't care at that point. Now, I'm probably putting words in His Honour's mouth by saying that, but that was certainly my interpretation of His Honour's attitude, because he believed, and I think correctly, a 6-month delay in a triple murder trial is a legitimate matter of public interest. The public has a right to know what Pete was claiming, why he was making that claims, and importantly, Justice Blue's going to have to sentence this man for 3 murders. He's going to somehow have to take all the stuff that we've heard till now in this series and turn it into a mathematical formula that arrives at a number of years that Pete will have to serve before he can seek parole. Justice Blue said, I want the public to understand the issues in this case so that they understand my ultimate sentence.
Because we already know, as we discussed in the last episode, there is already one life sentence on the table.
That's right.
We know that already. So as you said, we now need to sharpen our pencil and go back to the calculations of how do we come up with the formula for now what does that look like and why and how.
Because there is no more sentence than a life sentence.
Correct.
This isn't America. In America, you hear about people serving multiple life sentences. In South Australia, that doesn't happen. You are jailed for life. Life is determined to literally be the rest of your life. The question is how long you serve in prison, which is called a non-parole period. What's the minimum number of years you must serve before you can go to the parole board and say, I'm a good person now, I've learned my lesson, I've rehabbed my ways, it's time to let me back out. That's the number that Justice Blue was going to have to calculate. I was thinking at that moment, we're looking in the realm of 35 years.
Okay.
And the reason I came to that conclusion was because, as we've alluded to during this series so far, this was not the first triple murder in South Australia.
That's right.
That triple murder, the previous matter at a town called Kapunda, where a teenage girl and her parents were murdered by a young man who was obsessed with the girl, that young man went to jail for 35 years as a minimum.
Sure.
Given that this is a mother and 2 young children, no method of defending themselves, and we've heard the manner in which they died.
Sure.
You've got to think we're looking upwards of 35 years.
Of course.
So it makes sense why Justice Blue would want the entire community to be aware of all of the factors that go into this sentence.
You also said there, Sean, that this is just a left turn out of nowhere of what that was. So we now have to look at, well, we're not going to have the normal court proceedings that we expected. We are now going to go into a situation where we're going to have to look at these victim impact statements. So in a moment, I want to break down the concept of that, and then let's actually listen to, I guess, some of the impact that had on people. As I mentioned, Sean, we know that this has taken a bit of a turn, and we're now doing what we hadn't expected yet again. And we said we were going to move now into a situation where we're going to hear the victim impact statements. So this is the opportunity, in idea form at least, of those who are affected by such horrific situations and who are victims, get the opportunity to stand before a court and actually let them know, and for everyone who's there, the actual impact this had to them, their lives, and how they're trying to work through this process. Do I have that right?
You have that right. And as we spoke about in our last series, The Death of Jack Hanley, victim impact statements are subject to rules and laws. There are some things victims can say. There are some things they cannot say. Sometimes prosecutors can and will edit a victim impact statement as well to make sure it fits within those guidelines.
Sean, I don't know that that's something a lot of people or everyone's going to actually realise until now, because until I started having these sorts of discussions with you, I wasn't aware of that. I thought if you're a victim, you get to say how this has impacted you and affected you. Obviously, I get that you need to make sure there's not slander or defamatory, all that stuff, but...
Well, you can't defame a convicted person.
Well, I'd give it a crack.
I'm sure you'd give it a crack, yeah.
Beside that, though, you know what I mean? Like, I would have thought that you, for want of a better term, have free rein to say how this has impacted you. I know from talking to you that's not the case, and this situation right now is not the time to go down that rabbit hole, but I guarantee, and for those listening, we will come back and really investigate the idea of a victim impact statement, what it is, how it is, what can, can't, why, all those things that, I'm not going to lie, feel pretty frustrating to me right now. So, okay, we've taken that side step. Let's step back on this twisted path that we keep talking about. We now know we're moving in. So you're about to go back to court at the end of that week, as you said. doesn't quite go to plan.
As I'm walking into the courtroom where sentencing submissions are going to be held, I noticed in a little ante-room off to the left-hand side, Steve Egberts was in there with a prosecutor. Voices were raised. I thought, okay, take a step back. I've got a stated policy that I don't speak to victims of crime in between guilty pleas or convictions and victim impact statements. I don't believe that that's the point where a journalist should be asking you questions. You need to save your, I'll call it emotional ammunition for your victim impact statement. So I always take a step back. So I've not spoken to Steve and Janet since before the guilty pleas at this point.
Right.
Steve's in there with this prosecutor. Things are heated. Janet's standing just outside. She's crying. I go up to her and I say, "Are you all right?" She shakes her head but doesn't speak. She leans in. I give her a bit of a hug. I say, I'll see you afterwards. And she nods, still not saying a thing, wiping away tears. And I can hear Steve's voice and I can hear this prosecutor's voice. Very, very angry at one another. I slide into court. I'm a little concerned at this point, but there's nothing I can do. The court is convened. A minute or so later, Janet comes in. Steve follows after, and his face is thunder. Absolute thunder. But court's in session. I've got no opportunity to find out what's going on.
Yep.
And of course, at that point, that's when Donna Rigney is called to the bar table to give her victim impact statement.
Right. So regardless of what was or wasn't happening, which of course is going to get your interest to go, that's certainly something of importance to someone, clearly by both reactions of prosecutor and Steve. But that aside, okay, let's switch gears yet again. Donna takes a stand.
The business of court goes on, and Donna Rigney says that the day of the murders was the most painful of her life. She says, and I quote here, "I wanted to die as well. I wanted to die instantly and be with Yvette and the kids, but I couldn't." She looked at Pete and she said, "The pain you have caused me and my family has caused overwhelming grief every day and every night. I'm still crying every day and every night. It was like when you did this evil act to Yvette, Amber and Corey, evil entered our lives because I lost everything. All I want to say to you is may God have mercy on your soul, because God is who you will have to face when you leave this earth."
Yeah. As a mother who lost her daughter and her grandchildren, yeah, how much more heartfelt could that be?
It couldn't. It simply couldn't.
And you think about that, and you know that that's the case when you hear that read out, though. And here's the thing: I'm hearing you read that secondhand, Sean. I'm not sitting in court as you were, as Janet and Steve were, and everyone else there. Talk to me about what that emotion and what that felt like to hear that read out in court.
It's easy to read it out because I've got it written down. Donna read it through cracking voice, through heaving sobs, through tears. She paused a lot of the time. She had people supporting her almost physically at the bar table. She was in anguish, very, very distressed, very distraught. And have you ever heard someone sort of hold on to a word longer because they're just, it's a wail coming out of them as they're trying to say just a normal, ordinary word? That happened with Donna. She was, it's so hard to encapsulate in words, but it was that outpouring, weeping grief expressed through the usual syllables of language. And that's, like you say, what I've just read there is a pat, sanitized translation, and even then it carries so much power.
Yeah.
Not compared to hearing her.
Of course.
It was a wail of grief.
Yeah.
A wail of grief.
And not to diminish this, because you can't and shouldn't diminish that. For want of a better term, Donna's said her piece.
Yeah.
She then goes and sits down. And as horrible and as clinical and as cold as that almost sounds, thank you for your submission. You've said your piece. Now go back and sit down.
Yeah.
And I know I hate bringing it back to that, but that's kind of the reality of this. Like those words on a page and that emotion that came out of Donna is absolutely necessary for this. The other side to that coin is, and now we move on.
that's your shot.
Yeah.
That's your one moment to say something. The reason we do this show,
Yeah.
the reason that I do what I do every day at work is because I believe, victims don't get enough of a voice in the South Australian justice system. That's why. You've lost your daughter and your grandchildren. You've lost every Mother's Day, every Christmas, every birthday for the rest of your life. And that's your part of talking about that.
Yeah. And that's what I mean. Like, and I don't want to diminish that, but it kind of gets wrapped up in that little ball. There it is. And I'm going to feel like a real heel right now of doing this. In the interest of that, Janet then steps up.
Well, that's right. I expected it to be Janet and Steve.
Sure.
But it was Janet on her own. Steve stayed in the public gallery. Janet said that she loved the kids and Yvette more than life itself. She referred to Amber and Corey as the beautiful angels. She said, I was there in the delivery room holding Yvette's hand as she gave birth to both Amber and Corey. I had my first hold of each of the kids within minutes after they were born. That's where our bond started. We visited those three nearly every day. We couldn't get enough of their cuteness. We had lots of sleepovers and made many, many happy memories. I loved being a nana. I loved being their nana. And there was absolutely nothing Steve and I wouldn't do for them. And so I can't find the words to describe my pain and my empty feeling. The day of the murders replays in my mind all the time. The what-ifs or should-haves are the worst. Scenarios go on in my head constantly. I cry hysterically over it when I'm alone. Nobody or nothing can ever take this pain away. All I can do is take a day at a time. They say time will heal, but I'm never going to heal. The one thing I can guarantee is when Steve and I both close our eyes, we see their beautiful little faces. Neither of us have or will ever again sleep peacefully.
And again, Sean, it's hard just hearing you say those words, let alone watching a grieving grandparent say that. And there's a couple of key words that I picked up on in that. The past tense of the use of I loved being a grandmother.
Yeah.
Like just the concept of that recognition of that's never happening again. That status I had of that in those people's lives is gone. That doesn't exist anymore. That's a past tense. I just hope anyone listening to that takes the opportunity maybe just to think about those around them right now and maybe just smiles or says something nice or gives them a hug right now because, as I said, it's hard just hearing you say those words, Sean, let alone knowing what emotion must have come from that.
People often ask me why normal everyday life stuff doesn't bother me too much, why I let a lot of things go. When you're listening to that at work, you realise that every moment is precious. Yeah, that's twee. That's a greeting card kind of thing to say. It's true, people. Every moment is precious. Don't go to sleep on an argument. Don't say goodbye on a bad feeling because you just don't know. That's not fatalistic. That's not paranoid. No. That's not, depressive or negative or, pessimistic. It's possible. So why not just do what you can to just be kind and just be nice?
Sean, when you say that, I'm a big believer in exactly what you said. Don't go to sleep in an argument. All of those things. Don't let it lie. It's not worth it. There's the important things in life that we all too often let go and we shouldn't, right? Because we're not guaranteed tomorrow.
We're not.
We're not guaranteed tomorrow. When you hear a heartfelt, emotive outpouring like that, it just makes that, all the more real. Again, though, Janet says her piece and sits down.
I expected Steve to stand up next.
Yeah, that's my point. You said you expected Steve before.
I thought it might have been a joint victim impact statement. So when Janet gets up, I thought, okay, Janet and Steve are giving one each because they're entitled to do so.
Yeah.
They're both victims. They don't have to do it together. Steve stays sitting. Janet in tears, goes back to her seat,
Yeah.
doing a very good job of composing herself again and controlling herself again, but still visibly upset, sits down next to Steve, and that's it. That's the end of the victim impact statements. And I'm left wondering, well, hang on, I've gotten to know Steve. I know how passionate he is
Yeah.
about this. I know how forthright he is about this. Why doesn't Steve want to make a victim impact statement?
That's an interesting question, Sean. As you said, that is the end of the victim impact statements, though. So now we know we move to the next part, and we're going to have a chat about that in just a moment. And this is where we hear from both defence and the prosecution. Once we've heard both the victim impact statements here, Sean, we move to the next part, and that's, of course, to hear from both the defence and the prosecution as they enter their sentencing submission comments about here. So who's up first, and how does that go?
So what happens is defence usually goes first, and they're giving submissions in mitigation.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that he's pleaded guilty, they want him to get the minimum sentence possible.
Sure.
That's their job. So they are going to say things that will hopefully enliven the judge's mercy.
As you said, mitigating the severity, extremity, how horrible this sounds. Let's see how much that we can peel back to get, as you said, as minimum a sentence as possible.
Now put yourself in Bill Boko's shoes for a minute here. How do you make submissions in mitigation about the deaths of 3 people in these circumstances?
I don't know. I'm absolutely riveted to know how, and I pride myself on being able to defend the indefensible in regular arguments with you, Sean. You know
you
that.
do. You really do.
You know that. So
I know.
I'm intrigued to know how on earth you try and do that in this circumstance.
Mr. Boko did so with a great amount of empathy. He said, I'm not here to minimise Pete's guilt, nor am I here to speak ill of Yvette.
Right.
He said, my client feels a very deep sense of shame and regret over what has happened. It was never meant to happen. He held Miss Wilson Rigney in a great deal of affection, and he loved her children. That, of course, makes this entire matter difficult to understand. This man loved those children, which is such a hard thing to rationalise when you look at the outcome. That's where things turned a little bit.
Okay.
Mr. Boko next explained that, on his client's version of events, in the time that they had been together, remember, it had only been about a 4 or 5 month period that Yvette and Pete had been a couple.
Sure.
He said Yvette had struck, bashed, and kicked Pete on numerous occasions, and once ran him over with a car.
Okay.
He said that Pete had been taunted about his erectile dysfunction, and that Yvette had once tied up Pete's son with cable ties.
Right.
Mr. Boko went on to say, my client never once, on his instructions, retaliated. He just stood there and took it. And I think, Your Honour, there's some comparison there to what used to be referred to as battered wife's syndrome. I'm just going to pause there. If you are out there thinking, so the defence barrister is blaming the victim for her own death, you are correct.
I'm going to be honest, I didn't want to necessarily touch on that. I wanted to sort of let that sit for that exact reason. I'm choosing to offer that the resentment that statement deserves.
Well, hold on to your resentment because there's more coming. Mr. Boko explained next that on the day of the murder, Miss Wilson Rigney, his words, went mental because Pete refused to have sex with her. He suggested that Pete may have killed the children because those family's SA workers knocked on the door, but Pete can't really explain that because he really didn't know what had occurred. And I quote, in respect of the children, he professes limited recollection as to what happened there. Some people who are present when trauma occurs, even if it's brought about by their own hand, choose not to remember as a coping mechanism. Do you remember, way back when this was supposed to be for trial the first time, we heard claims that Pete was an automaton and that Yvette had somehow done something that had sparked his anger. Here we are 6 months later, psych reports, adjournments, delays, with a guilty plea to all 3 counts, but we have not moved.
Nope.
Because we are still blaming Yvette.
Yep.
and we are still claiming some degree of automatonism, we're just not claiming it as a complete exculpatory way of getting out of a murder conviction. We're just saying now that maybe these should be factors that lead to a shorter sentence for a murder conviction.
Yeah, we're not trying to get off of the whole thing with it, but we're certainly not going to let go of that. We're not ready to jump off the horse just yet. We're going to ride this pony into the ground if we can.
And as you can imagine, the prosecution did not like that at all.
How could you?
Because Tim Preston, the prosecutor at the time, stood up and said, Your Honour, reject this. This is simple. This is easy. Remember the allegation that Yvette was planning to leave Pete for a former boyfriend? He said, the most obvious explanation for Miss Wilson-Rigney's death is anger on Pete's behalf. The most obvious explanation for killing the children is that they witnessed the murder of their mother. We urge caution in accepting Pete's story as to what occurred. His conduct throughout this case betrays a degree of manoeuvring to lessen his culpability.
Absolutely. I called it out in the last episode where he has taken, absolutely, maybe it was the episode before, I can't remember now, took steps to minimise that, to remove that. He clearly knew what he had done was wrong and was trying to cover it up. And that was supposedly within his blackout state before his, what did you call it, realignment or something of his
cognitive
faculties.
realignment.
There you go. He had his cognitive realignment at the end of a fist to his face. So, Sean, that's... there was a statement in there, and I just want you to read it for me. We would advise caution in accepting that.
We would urge caution in accepting Pete's story as to what occurred. His conduct throughout this matter betrays a degree of manoeuvring to lessen his culpability.
We would urge caution. I'm pretty sure that most of our listeners right now are urging something toward Pete, and it's certainly not caution.
And what we've got to make very clear here is Bill Boko is not saying that he personally believes any of these things.
No.
He is instructed by his client.
Yep.
He can only do what he's told. And he said several times, on my instructions,
Yeah.
meaning this is what my client wants the court to be aware of.
Sean, that's probably another rabbit hole, wormhole we're going to delve down one day. The difference between what we truly believe and what we need to do under instruction for barristers, lawyers, and all that, because at times that's a hard place for them to navigate. And I'm going to leave it at that point because otherwise we could easily sidetrack into yet another tangent.
And it's a hard place for a judge as well, because as Justice Blue said, well, if we've got this factual dispute, and if you are still defence counsel claiming in any way, shape or form, any form of automatonism, then I really think the public needs to see that psychological report.
And how did that go down?
Like a lead balloon.
Right.
I was obviously very happy at this point. I wanted to see the psychological report, not even from a journalistic sense. I just wanted to understand. Steve and Janet wanted to understand. Donna wanted to understand.
Of course.
So Justice Blue says, all right, I'm not going to sentence today.
Okay, so there's still no sentence?
No, I'm not going to sentence today. And to be honest, nobody was expecting a sentence that day.
Okay.
In South Australia, you don't have the sentencing submissions finish and go straight into sentence. The judge needs time to go away, reconsider the evidence, read these psychological reports, and actually come to a conclusion.
Okay, that makes sense.
He said, I will set a date for sentencing at another time. But we're all going to come back next week because I want to hear from you why you're fighting me so hard on releasing this psychological report.
Okay.
I'll give prosecution and defence 7 days to figure out what their arguments are, and you can come back to me.
Okay.
So yet another week's adjournment.
So that's the end of the day?
That's the end of the day. The court is adjourned. Everyone stands up. The judge leaves.
Yep.
But as Justice Blue leaves, so does Steve Egberts.
Well, I was going to ask, did you get a chance to speak to Steve?
Steve left.
Right.
He left without Janet. He went straight out the door.
Okay.
It was almost that, and I don't want to lessen this, but you know that mental image of someone with smoke coming out of their ears? Steve left like there was smoke coming out of his ears.
Understandable.
He was out. He was onto Victoria Square. He was gone. I walked out with Janet. Janet was crying, and she said, I'll go find him. I know where the car is.
Yeah.
I said, all right, look, if you need anything, call me. Let me know.
Sure.
Donna left surrounded by her family. I spoke very briefly to her. She was just beside herself.
Of course.
Very, very, very upset. And that was it.
Okay.
You know, all off for another week.
So I do want to touch on that. So now we've got another week to wait. Okay. For the benefit of us now, listeners, we now fast forward that week because we don't have the frustrating element of actually having to wait that week. So we come back, and what happens now?
Steve wants to make a victim impact statement,
Okay.
which is great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Except he doesn't want to make his victim impact statement.
Mm.
He explains that what he wants to do is give a victim impact statement on behalf of Amber and Corey's father, his own son.
Okay, so victim impact statement by proxy almost.
By proxy.
Okay, sure.
Of course, the court allows that.
Excellent.
You know, there's no rule that the victims have to all do it on the same day.
Okay.
Thankfully, the empathy and the sympathy extends far
Sure.
enough to say, okay, that's fine, we'll give you time. Justice Blue says, we're here. Please, I'd love to hear
Sure.
from you. Steve makes a very short statement.
Yep.
He says, losing the children is an incomprehensible tragedy that has gutted the entire family,
Yep.
especially his son. He said, my son is now a shell of the man he once was. Watching him identify the bodies and bury his children was harder than anything you can imagine. The impact upon him cannot be explained. I ask for the maximum allowable sentence because of the cruelty shown to Amber and Corey and for the peace of mind of the father left behind.
Again, heartbreaking just hearing you say those words, not even knowing the emotion sentiment that came from that.
And imagine the trauma that the kid's father is going through.
Yeah.
He can't even make himself come to court to read that himself.
Absolutely.
And the strength that it takes for a father to stand for his son over the death of his grandchildren when he's
Yeah.
grieving himself.
Absolutely.
And now acting as the conduit for someone else's grief. I know a little bit what that's like, being the conduit for someone else's grief.
Absolutely.
But not when I'm grieving as well.
Yeah.
The strength of that family.
You mentioned previously that Steve was an incredibly strong man, and it must have taken some absolute fortitude to agree to do that on behalf of his son and then actually be able to stand there and deliver that also.
What came next, though, was, of course, the long-awaited argument over the psychological report. And to the surprise of nobody, defense counsel didn't want it released. They didn't want it released back in the day. They don't want it released now. Bill Boko says, in my respectful submission, the views of the families should be respected given the nature of this material. There would be an enormous amount of upset in addition to that which is generally seen in this sort of case. Justice Blue said, hang on. The families? Yes, Your Honour, Mr. Boko explained. This is a joint submission by defence and prosecution. Together we say you should not be releasing the psychological report.
So we've now got prosecution and defence working together to suppress the psychological report to the public.
And apparently, with the support of the families.
I want to touch on that and understand that because that seems incredibly strange to me. Sean, can you please just tell us, so why would the families object to this psych report being released to the public?
We very quickly found out the families, plural, didn't.
Okay.
It was a family, and it was the Rigney family.
Right.
Prosecutor Tim Preston explained to the court, it's not the Egberts that have a problem with the psych report being released. It's Donna Rigney. She has some serious reservations. The history that's been given by Pete about Miss Wilson Rigney amounts to an attack on her character.
Okay.
You can understand that.
Sure.
From the very start, Donna has always been worried and concerned with making sure that Yvette's character is not besmirched.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
What Pete said during those sentencing submissions through Mr. Boko was horrible.
Yeah,
It does
definitely.
amount to character assassination.
Agreed.
She doesn't want any more of that in the public.
Okay.
The Egberts, Mr. Preston explained, don't want the crime scene photos released. Well, that's fine. Nobody's interested in the crime scene photos.
Yeah, we're talking about the psych report.
And nobody in their right mind is going to publish those crime scene photos, let's be honest.
You'd hope not.
So Justice Blue says, I understand what you're saying. I understand those reservations. However, I'm going to release the psychological report. And I can't tell you what a rare bird that is for a judge to have submissions unified from the bench and say, no, I'm actually not going to do that. I'm going to go the other way. I believe this is in the public interest.
Sure.
So he ordered that the report be made available to the media. I was the first journalist to get my hands on it.
Okay.
And what I found gave me the answers, Daniel, that I had been waiting for. That report finally told me what had happened in that farmhouse and why.
What on earth did that say?
So this report was the prosecution psychological report.
Sure.
Remember the first psychological report by defense counsel? Way back when?
Absolutely, yes.
That was drafted by forensic psychologist Luke Broomhall.
Mm-hmm.
And that's referenced in this report. And it says that Mr. Broomhall found Pete had a patchy recall of events.
Yep.
And that was likely caused by abuse he had suffered during his relationship with Miss Wilson Rigney.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Broomhall said it's possible that he was in a dissociative state as a result,
Okay.
and somebody should explore that.
Right. Possible.
Not a confirmation.
Yeah, possible and explore is very different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just a somebody ought to look into this.
Yeah.
So the prosecution called Dr. William Brereton
Mm-hmm.
to reply. And Dr. Brereton had a very different opinion of things. He said that the way Pete had conducted himself in prison
Mm-hmm.
proved he was not in a dissociative state. Quote, in March of 2017, Pete told another prisoner he had organized to borrow a gun from a friend and arranged to kill Yvette on the Tuesday, the day after she was actually killed. He said that on the day of the murder, Amber became suspicious. Family's SA knocked. Pete told the children to be quiet and to go into their bedrooms. He said he separated the children as he thought he may have to kill them, and if the family's SA workers had entered the house, he would have killed them too.
This is a very different circumstance or scenario as what we've had played out to us previously.
This triple murder could have been a 5-person murder.
And even if it didn't occur on the day it did, he was planning for it to happen the day after anyway.
Think about what that day after was. The Tuesday was Steve Egbert's birthday.
Right.
Amber and Corey were going to see Steve and Janet that day. Pete knew this. His intention was always to murder Yvette, which is why he probably pleaded guilty at the very start to that.
Sure.
But his intent was never to kill the children. So the question is, why did the children die? And the answer was also in the report. By his own account, Dr. Brereton says, Pete hid Yvette's body, went out for a smoke, made the children breakfast, and formulated a plan to take them to their father. But then, of course, Amber became suspicious. Where's Mummy? Where's my mummy? I want to see Mummy. Brereton says, Pete trussed them up in a complicated manner. So complicated that it is not credible for Pete to assert he did not know his actions would almost certainly result in the deaths of the children.
Mm.
Think about the way those children were found. We're not going to go into that again. There's no way that you do that amount of callous, restrictive, almost sadistic work and not realize that you could potentially be causing somebody's death here.
Absolutely.
The children couldn't breathe.
Mm.
That alone is enough.
Yep.
That alone is enough. Dr. Brereton went on. Pete was worried about the discovery of his offence. His actions were a complex and protracted series of actions designed to achieve a clear goal, which was to avoid discovery.
Yep.
That's not the work of an automaton.
Agreed.
That's not the work of someone who has mentally left their body and is running on automatic pilot. That's the actions of a murderer, a cold-blooded, cowardly murderer whose sole purpose is, I need to get away with killing my girlfriend, so her kids have to die too.
I'm struggling to understand what that is, Sean, because playing that out in my head, even if you had somehow gotten away with taking Amber and Corey to their father's house, you still need to get away with... What was his plan from here? Like, I don't understand what on earth he thought he was going to achieve here that wouldn't get found out.
You remember Sean Eyre's first comment to Pete was, have you killed her? Mr. Eyre was worried about this, clearly, in the lead-up.
Absolutely.
You don't naturally just jump to, can I borrow a tarpaulin? Oh, wait, have you killed somebody?
Exactly.
Now we know why Sean Eyre reacted the way he did.
Agreed.
Why he was so terrified, why he was so concerned for that family, why he loaded Pete back in that car and drove him back there.
Yeah.
It didn't finish there, though, this psychological report, because Dr. Brereton said that even while he was interviewing Pete continued to insist he did not mean to murder the children. Quote, he said, I thought they'd be all right. They were beautiful kids. I didn't want them to die. They didn't deserve it. He said, I want my side told. People can judge me all they want. I'm not a monster. I did not intend to do it. Well, Stephen Graham Pete, you can insist that all you like. You killed a defenseless mother. You killed her 2 children after telling them you were going to send them to the people that loved them. You are a monster.
I don't know how to contend anything but that, Sean, honestly. As we've said all along, and as I said, from a number of episodes ago, the manner in which he went about what he did immediately after shows he had understanding that what he had done was wrong. He knew very early on, during this apparent automaton state that he claims, he was aware that his actions were criminal. He needed to get away with them. He needed to cover this up. He needed to do whatever he could to try to diminish his involvement in this situation.
And then once caught, he did everything to diminish his responsibility. The automaton state is a complete and utter lie.
Yeah.
He lied. He made it all up so that he would no longer be in the gun for the deaths of those 2 kids. He couldn't even man up and accept that he'd done what he had done.
Yeah.
The greatest tragedy in this for all of me, though, Daniel, remains. Why did Amber and Corey have to die? Yvette's life was in jeopardy from Pete at that time.
Sure.
Little short of divine intervention, it seems like, was going to save her life.
Yep.
Why not wait 24 more hours? Why not drive the kids to their father? Why not let Steve and Janet take them? Those 2 little kids did not need to die. Nobody needs to be murdered, but they specifically did not need to die.
Did we ever get any understanding of, this sounds horrible, why his intended plan for the Tuesday was brought forward a day to the Monday?
Apparently, Yvette, on Pete's story, and again, we don't know whether this is true or not, got every reason to disbelieve him now.
Absolutely.
But on Pete's story, Yvette either threatened him with or hit him upside the head with that vacuum cleaner pole that was found on the ground at the crime scene. That's the moment. So even in his final word on all of this, Pete still blames Yvette for her death and therefore for the deaths of her 2 children, which is a word that I cannot say on commercial radio, but it rhymes with bullspit.
From there, Sean, Justice Blue has released the psych report, which you've got a hold of. We've heard our victim impact statements. Presumably, we're going to now move towards a sentence.
That's right. Mercifully, at this point, we finally have all our answers. Everything's on the table. All the cards, as Mr. Boko likes to say, are on the table. Justice Blue brings everybody back for the sentencing. I told you earlier that the previous triple murder sentence in South Australia, the Kapunda triple murder, received a 35-year prison term.
Yeah.
Everybody sat down in that court expecting, knowing that with that, especially with that psychological report, Stephen Graham Pete was about to set a new record.
Yeah.
Which is why we were all beyond shocked when Justice Malcolm Blue announced that he was sentencing Pete to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 30 years.
To better understand that and the fallout from that, and yet another twist in this path of this labyrinth that continues to evolve, we'll pick this up in our next episode. Until then, once again, we want to thank everybody for tuning in to us, whether it's on 5AA or whether it's through our podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Please, as I said, go there, support, rate, review, leave some feedback. Until we get back to this, we just want you to hopefully think about today's episode and just remember that, we're not guaranteed tomorrow. Make sure that those around you know how much you care about them, love them, squeeze them a little bit tighter tonight after hearing this. This story does continue to evolve, and it goes into yet more twists and turns that no one could see coming. If you'd like to get a hold of us, please, you can do that via our Facebook and Instagram at Just Lawful Podcast. You can get us on Twitter at Just Lawful Pod. As always, you can follow Adelaide's true crime scene with Sean and his work with the advertiser at Sean Fuster. Until our next episode, we just want to remind you, enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you next time on the next episode of Just Lawful.